You will embark on an unforgettable journey through the life of Simón Bolívar, the liberator of South America. You will witness his rise, his victories, his betrayals, and his ultimate struggle to unite a continent. His legacy will echo through history forever. The winds of revolution did not yet stir the lands of South America when Simón Bolívar was born on July 24, 1783, in Caracas, Venezuela. He was born into wealth, a child of privilege in a society bound by rigid colonial rule. His family, one of the wealthiest in the Spanish Americas, owned vast estates and countless enslaved laborers. Yet despite his privileged upbringing, fate had other plans for the boy who would one day be called El Libertador. Bolívar's childhood was shaped as much by tragedy as it was by wealth. His father, Juan Vicente Bolívar y Ponte, died when Simón was just 3 years old. His mother, María de la Concepción Palacios, followed him to the grave when the boy was only 9. Orphaned and vulnerable, Bolívar found himself under the care of his maternal uncle, Carlos Palacios, who had little interest in raising a child. Isolated in his own home, Bolívar sought companionship elsewhere. It was his tutor, Simón Rodríguez, who filled the void left by his parents. Rodríguez was no ordinary teacher. He was a radical thinker, a man of the Enlightenment, and a believer in republican ideals that directly challenged Spanish rule. He introduced Bolívar to the works of Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu, ideas that would later ignite the fires of revolution in his heart. But in those early years, Bolívar was still just a restless boy, yearning for adventure, struggling under the weight of expectations. As he grew, his family sent him to Spain in 1799 to complete his education, a journey that would forever alter his destiny. The streets of Madrid were alive with political intrigue. The French Revolution had shaken Europe to its core. The Napoleonic Wars loomed on the horizon, and the power of the Spanish crown, though formidable, was beginning to crack. It was in Madrid that Bolívar met María Teresa Rodríguez del Toro y Aleza, a woman who captured his heart with the same intensity that revolution would one day claim it. They married in 1802, and Bolívar, for the first time, envisioned a peaceful future. One away from war, away from struggle, just him and María Teresa, building a life together in Venezuela. But fate, as it often did in Bolívar's life, had other plans. Less than a year after their return to Caracas, María Teresa fell ill with yellow fever. Bolívar watched helplessly as the disease consumed her, and in 1803, she died in his arms. He was only 20. Grief-stricken, Bolívar changed forever. He swore never to marry again. And he never did. María Teresa's death stripped away the last remnants of his innocence, and in the depths of sorrow, he turned to his true calling, the cause of revolution. His loss pushed him back into the intellectual embrace of Simón Rodríguez, whom he met again in Europe. The two men traveled to France, where Bolívar witnessed firsthand the crowning of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1804. At first, he admired the French leader's ambition. But then he saw something else, something that disturbed him. Napoleon had turned the revolution into his own empire, had traded liberty for power, had become a monarch in all but name. The sight left an impression on Bolívar, a warning of what absolute power could do. And then, in 1805, standing atop Monte Sacro in Rome, Bolívar made a vow that would echo through history. I swear before you, I swear by the God of my fathers, I swear on their graves, I swear by my country that I will not rest. My arm shall not rest, nor my soul be at peace, until I have broken the chains that bind us to Spain. It was a moment of transformation. Bolívar was no longer just a grieving young aristocrat. He was now a man of purpose, a man of fire, a man who had seen the chains of oppression and vowed to break them. With the fire of revolution burning inside him, he returned to Venezuela in 1807. But the land he came back to was still shackled to Spain, still controlled by colonial governors who ruled with an iron fist. The seeds of rebellion had not yet taken root, but they were waiting for the right moment, waiting for the right leader. That moment would come sooner than anyone expected. The Napoleonic Wars were tearing Spain apart. King Ferdinand VII had been deposed. The Spanish Empire was thrown into chaos. Across the Atlantic, in the Spanish colonies, a question emerged. A dangerous question. If Spain itself is in turmoil, why should we remain loyal to a broken king? In April 1810, the people of Caracas finally acted. The colonial authorities were expelled, and for the first time in history, Venezuela declared itself an independent republic. But revolution is never simple, never easy. And Bolivar knew that true independence would not come from words alone. It would have to be won on the battlefield with blood, with sacrifice, with war. And so, Bolivar prepared for the fight of his life. The liberator of South America had begun his journey, and the world would never be the same. Simón Bolívar had returned to Venezuela, but the land he called home was not the same as when he had left. Nor was he the same man who had once walked its streets. The fire of revolution had ignited in his heart, but around him, the colonial order still stood firm. Spanish authorities governed with an iron grip. The Creole elites hesitated, unsure whether to embrace change or cling to stability. And the common people, though restless, remained shackled by centuries of royalist rule. The chains of empire had not yet broken, but they were beginning to crack. Across the Atlantic, the world was changing. Napoleon's armies had swept through Spain, toppling the Bourbon monarchy and replacing it with a puppet ruler, Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's own brother. The Spanish Empire was in chaos. Resistance flared within Spain itself, and from Madrid to Cádiz, patriotic juntas were rising to oppose the French occupation. The question now loomed over the Spanish colonies. Who ruled in the Americas? If Spain itself was no longer governed by a Spanish king, what claim did its colonial administrators still hold? The first tremors of rebellion were felt in Caracas, where whispers of independence grew louder with each passing day. But Bolivar knew whispers alone would not be enough. If Venezuela were to be free, it would take bold action. It was then that he crossed paths with a man who had once dreamed of the same revolution. Francisco de Miranda. A veteran of wars across 3 continents, Miranda had fought for American independence alongside Washington, had seen the fires of the French Revolution firsthand, and had even attempted to free Venezuela once before, in 1806. That attempt had failed, and he had been forced into exile. But now, with Spain weakened and unrest growing, Miranda returned to Caracas. Bolivar, still a young revolutionary, looked to Miranda as a mentor, a leader, a man who had already walked the path he himself was now beginning. Together, they joined forces with other Venezuelan patriots, forming the heart of a revolutionary movement. The time for hesitation had passed. April 19, 1810, a day that would be remembered forever in Venezuela's history. The streets of Caracas were alive with tension. Spanish Governor Vicente Emprin stood before the local council, the Cabildo, as voices rose in anger. The people demanded change, demanded autonomy. And then came the moment that shattered centuries of colonial rule. A vote. A simple vote that determined Venezuela would no longer obey Spanish authority. Emprin, realizing that power was slipping from his grasp, attempted to speak, but the church bells rang out through the city, drowning his words. A signal that the people had already chosen their path. It was over. The first major blow to Spanish rule had been struck. The first Venezuelan republic had been born. Bolivar stood at the heart of it all. But victory was still a distant dream. The new republic was fragile, divided, torn between those who sought full independence and those who still clung to loyalty to Ferdinand VII, the deposed Spanish king. The old order had not yet fallen, and the enemy was already preparing to strike back. From Spain, orders came swiftly. The royalists would not allow this rebellion to stand, and they would not need to fight alone. Within Venezuela itself, opposition to the republic grew. Many still saw Bolivar and his allies as dangerous radicals, as men who would bring chaos, not liberty. Across the country, armed resistance to the new government erupted. The dream of independence was under siege. Bolivar, though young, knew what was coming. War was inevitable. He had studied history, he had seen what had happened in the United States, in France, in Spain itself. Revolutions were never bloodless, and the road to liberty was paved with sacrifice. But before war came, Bolivar embarked on a journey that would shape the revolution's future. He was sent to Great Britain in a desperate bid to seek support. If the Republic was to survive, it needed allies, weapons, supplies. In London, Bolivar walked the halls of power, meeting with British officials, men who had once been Spain's rivals, but who now hesitated to involve themselves in South America's struggles. Britain, though interested in weakening Spanish influence, was wary, reluctant to support a cause that might fail. Bolivar pressed forward, arguing that Venezuela's independence was not just inevitable, but just that the people had a right to govern themselves. Though no formal alliance was secured, Bolivar did not leave empty-handed. He met with Francisco de Miranda once more, persuading him to return to Venezuela. This time not as an exile but as a leader of the new republic. By July 1811, the First Venezuelan Republic had taken its next great step. The Congress convened, and after heated debate, Venezuela officially declared independence on July 5, 1811. The ink had barely dried on the declaration when reality set in. The war had begun. Royalist forces, backed by loyalists within Venezuela, launched a counterattack. The fragile republic, still untested, found itself besieged from within and without. The army was weak, untrained, outnumbered. Spanish forces moved swiftly, reclaiming lost territory, crushing resistance wherever it arose. The republic had declared its birth, but Spain was determined to strangle it before it could stand. It was during this time that Bolivar proved himself not just a revolutionary, but a warrior. Though he had no formal military training, his instinct for leadership was undeniable. He fought in battle after battle, rallying troops, inspiring them with the promise of a free Venezuela. Yet, despite their efforts, the tide of war turned against them. By 1812, disaster struck. A massive earthquake shattered Venezuela, destroying cities and towns. And worse, the destruction disproportionately hit Republican strongholds. Superstition ran rampant. Royalist priests declared the quake divine punishment for Venezuela's rebellion. Fear and despair spread like wildfire. In the chaos, Miranda, once the Republic's greatest hope, lost his resolve. Seeing the situation as hopeless, he sought to negotiate with the Spanish. Bolivar was furious. He had believed in Miranda, had fought beside him. But now, he saw a man willing to surrender when the fight had only just begun. It was Bolivar himself who ordered Miranda's arrest, ensuring that the aging revolutionary would never lead again. Some called it betrayal, others a necessary sacrifice. Regardless, it was clear now that the struggle for independence would need a new leader, one who would never surrender, one who would never stop fighting. The dream of a free Venezuela lay in ruins. The First Republic had collapsed under the weight of war, betrayal, and disaster. The Spanish had reclaimed their grip on the land, and those who had fought for liberty were either dead, in chains, or exiled. For many, it seemed as if the revolution had been nothing more than a fleeting spark, quickly extinguished by the reality of Spanish power. But for Simón Bolívar, defeat was only the beginning. He had fled Venezuela with his life, but not with his spirit. In Cartagena, New Granada, Bolívar found himself among allies, men who had also thrown off the Spanish yoke and were struggling to maintain their own fragile republic. It was here, in the aftermath of Venezuela's fall, that Bolívar put pen to paper and wrote the Cartagena Manifesto. It was not merely a letter. It was a battle cry. In it, he laid out the hard truth. The failure of Venezuela's First Republic had not been due to Spanish strength alone. It had been due to internal weakness, division, and hesitation. The Republic had been too lenient with its enemies, too slow to build a strong central government, too fearful of wielding the full force of revolution. Bolívar made it clear if independence was to be won, it could not be through half measures. The next war would need to be total, decisive, absolute. The leaders of New Granada read his words carefully. They saw in Bolívar not just a man of ideas, but a man of action. A soldier who had fought on the battlefield, who had seen the cost of failure firsthand. And so they did not hesitate. They gave him a command. Bolívar, still only 30 years old, was handed a small army. It was not much, just a few hundred men, but it was enough. Enough to start what would later be called the Admirable Campaign. Enough to take back Venezuela. And so, in 1813, Bolívar crossed the border. The invasion had begun. The terrain was brutal. The heat, suffocating. The rivers, treacherous. But Bolívar pushed forward, leading his men through jungle and mountain, across fields and rivers, into the very heart of Venezuela. He knew that speed was his greatest weapon. If he struck fast, before the Spanish could react, he could take them by surprise. And that is exactly what he did. One city after another fell before him. In Cucuta, he won a decisive battle, driving out Spanish forces and securing a crucial foothold. With each victory, more men joined his cause. The ranks of his army swelled as Venezuelans, inspired by the return of their exiled hero, took up arms. Bolívar did not fight like the Spanish. He did not fight like the old generals of the First Republic. He fought with fury, with relentless aggression, with a strategy that was as much psychological as it was military. He knew that this war was not just about bullets and swords. It was about breaking the enemy's will. And so, he issued his most famous decree: Spaniards and Canarians, count on death, even if you are indifferent. Americans, count on life, even if you are guilty. This was no longer a war of words. It was a war of vengeance. Bolivar called it the war to the death. It was a brutal, merciless campaign. No longer would revolutionaries take prisoners. No longer would they allow royalists to regroup, to negotiate, to betray them again. Bolivar made it clear: those who stood against independence would be eradicated. The Spanish had shown no mercy in their conquest of the Americas. Now, Bolivar would show them none in return. His march continued. In Merida, he was hailed as El Libertador for the first time. The people, weary of Spanish oppression, welcomed him as a savior. The name stuck. From that moment on, he was no longer just Simón Bolívar. He was the liberator. With his army growing, with each victory solidifying his legend, Bolívar pressed onward. He had no time to slow down, no time to celebrate. The Spanish still held Caracas, and Bolívar would not stop until the capital was his. The final approach to Caracas was marked by one last battle, the defining moment of the campaign, the Battle of Taguanes. The Spanish had set up defenses, hoping to halt Bolívar's advance, but they underestimated him. With a bold maneuver, Bolívar outflanked them, cutting off their escape. The battlefield became a slaughter, royalist forces collapsed, and those who survived fled in panic. With Taguanes won, the road to Caracas lay open. On August 6, 1813, Bolívar entered the city as a conqueror. The same streets that had seen his exile now roared with celebration. The same government that had fallen to the Spanish now stood once more in the hands of revolutionaries. The First Republic had died, but Bolívar had forged a second republic from its ashes. The people hailed him as a hero, but Bolívar knew the war was not yet over. The Spanish would return. They always did. He had reclaimed Venezuela, but he had yet to secure it. The forces of the empire still lurked in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike back. And when they did, Bolívar would face his greatest test yet. The revolution had been reborn. But so too had the war. The fight for South America's true independence was only just beginning. Caracas belonged to the revolution once more. Bolívar had returned not as an exile, not as a defeated dreamer, but as El Libertador. The people cheered him as he entered the city. They threw flowers, sang songs of triumph, and whispered that the Spanish had finally been driven out for good. For a moment, it seemed as if Venezuela was free, that Bolívar had delivered his people from tyranny, that the Second Republic would stand where the first had crumbled. But Bolívar knew better. Victory was never final. Not in war. The Spanish were not gone. Only retreating, watching, waiting. Their generals knew that time was on their side. If they could not hold the cities, they would take the countryside. If Bolívar had won the people's hearts, they would turn the people against him. They did not need to defeat him in battle. They only needed to break the fragile unity of his republic. And that unity was already starting to crack. Bolívar had promised vengeance, had declared the war to the death, and his decree had not been ignored. Across Venezuela, royalists were being executed. Entire towns were caught in the bloodshed. Some fought out of loyalty to Spain, but others, simple farmers and laborers, were drawn into the chaos whether they wished it or not. The revolution had become a storm, and not everyone wished to stand in its path. Then came José Tomás Boves. Boves was not a Spanish general. He was not a nobleman or a soldier of the empire. He was a man of the people, a brutal, ruthless leader who saw an opportunity in the war. Where Bolívar rallied the educated elite, Boves spoke to the disenfranchised, the outcasts, the angry and the desperate. He built an army, not of professional soldiers but of slaves, outlaws, and the dispossessed. He promised them revenge, plunder, and destruction. He told them that Bolívar's republic was not a republic for them, that it was just a new empire in disguise. And the people listened. Boves and his army, known as Los Llaneros, swept across Venezuela like a plague. They were ruthless, merciless. They fought not to win battles, but to destroy. Towns were burned, civilians slaughtered, Entire regiments of Bolivar's forces were butchered without mercy. Bolivar tried to stop them. He marched his armies against Boves, seeking to cut him down before his rebellion could spread. The battles were fierce, but Boves fought differently. He refused to meet Bolivar in open battle. Instead, he used guerrilla tactics, striking from the shadows, vanishing before Bolivar's forces could retaliate. The tide of war shifted, and Bolivar was now the one on the defensive. Then came the final blow. Boves led a surprise assault on the heart of Venezuela. His forces cut through Bolivar's defenses like fire through dry grass. Towns that had sworn loyalty to Bolivar were burned to the ground. The streets of Caracas, once filled with cheers for El Libertador, now ran with blood. The Second Republic was falling, collapsing faster than Bolivar could stop it. He had fought so hard to reclaim Venezuela, but now he faced the bitter truth. He was losing not just to the Spanish but to his own people. The very people he had sworn to liberate had turned against him. Betrayal had come. But it was only the beginning. Bolivar, seeing the destruction unfolding around him, made a desperate decision. He could not save Venezuela, not yet. If he stayed, he would be captured, killed, or worse, forgotten. He had to retreat, he had to survive. But not all his allies agreed. Among them was Santiago Moreno, one of Bolivar's most trusted generals. Moreno did not believe in retreat. He wanted to stay and fight, to die if necessary. He accused Bolivar of cowardice, of abandoning the revolution. Others whispered the same. The great El Libertador fleeing like a common criminal. Bolivar heard their words, but he knew there was no other choice. On July 6, 1814, Bolivar abandoned Caracas. The city he had liberated only a year earlier was now lost once more. With a few hundred loyal soldiers, he marched toward the coast, hoping to reach safety before Boves's forces caught him. But the night held one final betrayal. As Bolivar and his men reached the port of Puerto Cabello, a Spanish stronghold, they expected to find safety, a place to regroup, to escape and plan their next move. But inside the fortress, Spanish forces had already taken control. The gates were shut. The walls bristled with cannons. The escape route was cut off. And then, the gunfire began. Shots rang out in the night as Bolivar's men were slaughtered in the darkness. Some tried to flee, but the streets were filled with royalist soldiers. Others fought to the last, their blood staining the ground where Bolivar had once vowed to break the chains of tyranny. Bolivar himself barely escaped with his life. He fled into the wilderness, his dream of a second republic shattered. It was over. Venezuela was in ruins. The revolution had been crushed. His army was dead, his allies scattered. For the second time, Bolivar had lost everything. The world had no place for El Libertador anymore, or so it seemed, because Bolivar was not done yet. Not even close. He would rise again. And this time he would not fight for Venezuela alone. This war would be bigger than a single country. This war would be for all of South America. And Bolivar would not stop until every Spanish soldier had been driven from the continent forever. Exile. Again. Bolivar had lost everything. Venezuela, the land he had fought so hard to liberate, was no longer his to command. The Second Republic had crumbled, not just under the weight of Spanish muskets, but from within, torn apart by division, betrayal, and the merciless war waged by José Tomás Boves. Bolivar had fled, escaping with only his life, but his cause had not died. Yet, as he stood on the shores of Cartagena, looking out across the sea, he knew the truth. He had failed. For the second time, he had tried to build a republic. For the second time, it had collapsed. The Spanish were stronger than ever, their rule over South America reasserted with brutal force. The dream of independence, which had seemed so close, now felt more distant than ever. But Bolivar was not the kind of man to surrender. He pleaded for support from the government of New Granada, but the leaders of the fragile republic hesitated. They had their own wars to fight, their own survival to consider. Bolivar's reputation was in question. Some whispered that he was reckless, that he had led Venezuela to ruin. Others still believed in him. But belief alone was not enough. So Bolivar turned elsewhere. In May 1815, he set sail for Jamaica, an island under British rule, hoping to find new allies, new weapons, new hope. The journey was long, and when he arrived, he found himself alone, without resources, without an army. He had no country, no official position, just his name, his vision, and the relentless fire inside him. He lived in Kingston as a guest, a man in exile waiting for the world to listen. And so, Bolivar did what he had always done best. He wrote. His Jamaican letter, written on September 6, 1815, was more than a plea for help. It was a prophecy, a declaration, a vision of what South America could become. He addressed it to an English gentleman, but his true audience was the world. He laid bare the tragedy of the continent, how for 3 centuries, Spain had ruled with iron chains, how millions had suffered under tyranny and oppression, how the people of South America had lived not as citizens, but as subjects, slaves to a distant king who cared nothing for them. But Bolivar did not just speak of suffering. He spoke of the future. A great revolution is sweeping America, he wrote, and it is destined to change the fate of the world. He declared that independence was inevitable, that no matter how many revolutions failed, no matter how many battles were lost, the tide of history had already turned. Spain's empire, once so mighty, was rotting from within, could not hold back the march of time. The day will come, he wrote, when our continent will break its chains and rise as a great confederation of nations. As free and sovereign republics, united in brotherhood. It was a bold vision, and one that many thought impossible. Bolivar dreamed of unity, not just the independence of one nation, but of all South America, bound together as a single force, free from the divisions that had doomed past revolutions. He saw a continent ruled not by kings, nor by foreign empires, but by its own people. But he also warned of danger. If we do not unite, he wrote, we will fall one by one. If we do not build our own strength, we will become the pawns of greater powers. He feared that South America, if it did not stand together, would become a battleground for foreign empires, Britain, France, even the United States, each eager to claim pieces of the fallen Spanish territories for themselves. Independence alone was not enough. Without unity, Bolivar feared, the wars of liberation would lead to new tyrannies, new divisions, new empires. The dream would die before it could be fulfilled. He sent the letter far and wide, hoping that someone, somewhere, would answer his call. But in Jamaica, no army came. No ships, no weapons, no promises of alliance. The British, ever cautious, remained neutral. They saw Bolivar as a revolutionary, a man who could destabilize their own colonies if he succeeded. His words impressed them. But words alone would not change the world. And then came the assassins. Bolivar had made many enemies. The Spanish had spies everywhere, and in Jamaica they found their chance. One night, as Bolivar lay sleeping in his rented house, a man slipped inside, knife in hand. The blade came down. But Bolivar was not in his bed. By sheer luck, he had switched rooms that night. The assassin plunged the dagger into the wrong man. The warning was clear. Spain wanted Bolivar dead. He could not stay in Jamaica. His revolution had no home there. But then, a lifeline. From the island of Haiti, word arrived. Alexander Peshin, the leader of the world's first black republic, had read Bolivar's letter. And he was willing to help. Bolivar set sail for Haiti, where he was welcomed not as an exile, but as a warrior in need. Peshin saw in Bolivar something familiar. Another man fighting against colonial oppression. Another man willing to risk everything for freedom. But Peshin made one demand. If Bolivar wanted Haiti's help, he had to abolish slavery in every land he liberated. Bolivar hesitated. He knew that many of his own supporters, the wealthy elites, still depended on slavery. He knew that agreeing to Peshin's terms would mean alienating powerful allies. But he also knew it was the right thing to do. And so he made a vow. I will liberate not only my country, he told Peshin, but the slaves who suffer within it. With Haiti's support, Bolivar raised a new army. He gathered weapons, supplies, and ships. He was no longer alone. The revolution had found new life. In 1816, Bolivar set sail once more for Venezuela. He had no guarantees, no certainty of victory. He had been defeated before. He had lost his home, his armies, his republics. But he had not lost his vision. He had declared that independence was inevitable. Now he would make that prophecy a reality. The war was far from over. But Bolivar was ready to begin again. The ship cut through the waves, the salty wind whipping against the faces of those aboard. The men were quiet, Some were hardened veterans, others freshly recruited fighters who had only heard stories of war. At the bow stood Simón Bolívar, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He was returning, not as a hero, not as a conqueror, but as a man with unfinished business. Venezuela had rejected him once. The republic had collapsed beneath his feet. He had fled in disgrace, his enemies triumphant, his name whispered in the streets as a man who had tried and failed. But failure was not an end. It was only another battle in a long war. This time, Bolivar would not be alone. Behind him lay Haiti, the only nation that had truly answered his call. While Britain and the United States had turned their backs, while New Granada had wavered, Haiti had seen something in Bolivar that the others had not, a reflection of their own struggle. Alexander Pétion, the leader of Haiti, had listened when Bolivar had spoken of liberty. He had understood the cost of revolution because he had lived it himself. Haiti had fought against the French, against slavery, against the idea that some men were destined to rule over others. And now, Haiti had given Bolivar everything he needed to return to the fight. But Pétion had not given his aid freely. His price was not gold, nor land, nor titles. It was something far more profound. If you wish for my support, Bolivar, then you must not only free your country. You must also free its slaves. The words had hung in the air between them, undeniable. Bolivar had hesitated. He knew that many of the landowning elites who had once supported him relied on slavery, that abolishing it would turn them against him. But what choice did he have? Was his revolution only for some, or was it for all? And so, Bolivar had made a promise. The man who once fought for Venezuela's liberty would now fight for the liberty of all. Now, with Haiti's weapons and soldiers at his side, Bolivar returned to Venezuela. This was not the first time he had attempted to reclaim his homeland. But this time, he knew he could not afford to fail. The shores of Venezuela came into view, green, wild, untouched by time. The land was the same, but everything else had changed. The Spanish were stronger than ever, their forces reinforced after crushing the Second Republic. The people, once hopeful, had seen too many revolutions fail. Too many dreams turn to dust. The question hung over Bolivar like a storm cloud. Would they rise again, or had the dream of independence already died? The first landing was met with resistance. Spanish patrols had been waiting. The fight began before Bolivar even stepped fully onto Venezuelan soil. Muskets cracked, swords clashed, and his men fought not for victory, but for survival. It was a brutal introduction to his second attempt. He had hoped that his return would ignite the people, that they would rally to him as they once had. But fear still ruled the land. The people had seen what had happened last time. They had seen the war, the destruction, the vengeance of José Tomás Boves, whose army of llaneros had swept across the land like a wildfire. Even though Boves himself was dead, the memory of his merciless slaughter lingered. Would Bolivar's revolution be any different? For months, Bolivar fought. His forces moved across Venezuela, engaging in skirmishes, ambushes, small victories that felt hollow in the face of the larger war. The Spanish were entrenched, unyielding. The old landowning elites who had once supported Bolivar hesitated, uncertain whether he was still their champion or their enemy. And then came the betrayal. One of Bolivar's closest allies, Manuel Piar, had been a brilliant general, but also a dangerous rival. Unlike Bolivar, Piar had deep support among the mixed-race and indigenous soldiers who made up much of the revolutionary army. He had started to believe that Bolivar's vision was not enough, that the Real Revolution needed to be even more radical. Piar did not want a new Venezuela ruled by Creole elites. He wanted true equality for black men, indigenous men, and the lower classes who had fought and bled for independence. And so, he made his move. He rebelled against Bolivar. The two men had once fought side by side, but now they were enemies. Bolivar could not ignore the challenge. He could not allow his revolution to fracture before it had even begun. And so, he did what history would never let him forget. He ordered Piar's execution. It was the first time Bolivar had killed one of his own. But it would not be the last. The message was clear. Bolivar's revolution would not be derailed. There would be one leader, one vision, one cause. Those who stood in the way, no matter how brilliant, would be removed. The execution sent shockwaves through the revolution. Some feared Bolivar was becoming a dictator, willing to sacrifice even his own allies to maintain control. Others saw it as necessary proof that Bolivar was willing to make the hard decisions that leadership demanded. But despite the internal struggles, something was changing. Bolivar's forces, once scattered and weak, were growing stronger. New Granada, seeing that Bolivar was not finished, began to lend support. Supplies started flowing in. Reinforcements arrived. His vision of a unified South American revolution was finally taking shape. And then, Bolivar made his boldest move yet. In 1817, he took Angostura, a key city deep in Venezuelan territory. It became the beating heart of his new revolution, a place from which he could launch his grandest campaign yet. The liberation of Venezuela was not enough. Bolivar now saw that the war had to be fought on a continental scale. The dream of independence could not survive if only one nation stood free. The Spanish would always return. They would always regroup, always crush whatever fragile republics arose in their place. There was only one way to end the war. He had to take the fight to Colombia, to Ecuador, to Peru, to the last great Spanish stronghold. Bolivar's exile had changed him. He had gone to Jamaica, a man who had lost everything. But now he was back, stronger, more determined, more ruthless than ever before. The war for independence had entered its final stage, and Bolivar would not stop until all of South America was free. Bolivar stood at the edge of the Orinoco River, the muddy waters reflecting the firelight from his camp. The jungle stretched endlessly behind him, thick, humid, and filled with unseen dangers. His army, now hardened by years of struggle, gathered in clusters around their makeshift shelters, men who had fought and bled for a dream that was still out of reach. They had taken Angostura, they had rebuilt their strength, but the war was far from over. Venezuela was still not safe, and Bolivar knew that as long as the Spanish ruled in Bogotá, Caracas could never be truly free. Victory in one place meant nothing if the empire remained intact elsewhere. Bolivar's vision had expanded beyond Venezuela. He no longer saw the war as a series of isolated battles. He saw it as a continental struggle. The Spanish were deeply entrenched in New Granada, modern-day Colombia, using Bogotá as a stronghold from which to launch attacks against the revolution. If Bolivar wanted to secure Venezuela's independence, he had to strike at the heart of Spanish power in South America. But what he planned next was impossible. At least that's what his enemies believed. He would cross the Andes. It was madness. The Andes were a wall of death. Freezing temperatures, brutal winds, towering peaks that had humbled armies for centuries. The Spanish, confident in their dominance, believed no force could survive such a journey. And that was precisely why Bolivar chose it. If he succeeded, he would take the Spanish completely by surprise. If he failed, he and his men would vanish in the ice, lost forever in the mountains. The decision was made. In June 1819, Bolivar's army, just 2,500 men, began the impossible march. The journey was a nightmare. Men died every day. The cold gnawed at their bones. The air thinned as they climbed higher, and the narrow paths threatened to crumble beneath their feet. Horses collapsed, unable to continue. Supplies ran low. Some men, unable to go any farther, lay down in the snow and never rose again. Bolivar pushed forward. He rode at the front, urging his men onward, not as a distant commander, but as one of them. He suffered as they suffered, fought through the same misery, endured the same hunger, the same pain. Days stretched into weeks, and then, they emerged. Against all odds, Bolivar's army descended from the Andes, battered and weak, but alive. And they were no longer an army of exiles. They were a force reborn. The Spanish never saw them coming. At Boyaca, on August 7, 1819, Bolivar struck. His troops, despite the exhaustion, fought with the fury of men who had already defeated death. The Spanish, caught off guard, fell into disarray. The battle was fierce, but it was swift. Within hours, the Spanish army was shattered. It was over. New Granada was liberated. Bolivar rode into Bogotá not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The people cheered, bells rang, and for the first time, the idea of a truly independent South America felt real. But Bolivar had something even greater in mind. He had not just fought to free New Granada. He had fought to create something new. A nation, a union of liberated lands, stronger together than they could ever be apart. And so, in December 1819, at the Congress of Angostura, Bolivar declared the creation of Gran Colombia, a vast republic that would unite Venezuela, New Granada, Colombia, Ecuador and Panama under one banner. A new nation had been born, one that he believed could stand against the world. But Bolivar was not naive. He knew that declaring a nation was one thing, keeping it together was another. The war was not over. The Spanish still held Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. Forces loyal to the crown still lurked in Venezuela, waiting for their chance to strike. And even among his own allies, there were whispers of doubt. Could a republic that spanned thousands of miles truly survive? Could nations with different histories, different peoples, different ambitions be bound together by a single idea? Bolivar believed they could. But belief alone would not be enough. The Spanish would return. Old allies would become new enemies. And Bolivar's greatest test was still yet to come. Gran Colombia had been declared, but Bolivar knew that words alone could not forge a nation. The Spanish had been driven from New Granada, but they still held Venezuela, and as long as they remained, the war was not over. The dream of unity was fragile. It could crumble at any moment. If Gran Colombia was to survive, Venezuela had to be freed, completely, permanently, without the threat of Spanish return. And so, Bolivar prepared for war once more. The Spanish still controlled Caracas, Maracaibo, Puerto Cabello, strategic strongholds that allowed them to move troops, launch counterattacks, and maintain their rule. Bolivar could not allow them time to rebuild. He had to strike now. But the Spanish were ready. General Miguel de la Torre, commander of the royalist forces, had drawn a line in the sand. He knew that if he lost Venezuela, Spain's grip on South America would be broken forever. His forces, nearly 5,000 strong, were among the best-trained royalist soldiers left on the continent. They dug in at Carabobo, a key position that stood between Bolivar's army and Caracas. Bolivar's army was outnumbered, but they had something greater than numbers. They had momentum, they had the dream of freedom, and they had the Llaneros. Led by the fierce and unpredictable José Antonio Páez, these cavalrymen were the wild heart of Venezuela. Fighters who had once ridden for the Spanish, but now fought for Bolivar. They knew the land, they knew the enemy, and they knew no fear. Bolivar saw the battlefield before him. The Spanish entrenched, their artillery positioned on the hills, their infantry holding firm. A direct assault would be suicide. He needed a strategy, and so he devised a plan that would change history. On June 24, 1821, at the break of dawn, the Battle of Carabobo began. Bolivar's forces advanced, drawing Spanish fire. The Royalists, confident in their superior position, held the line. Their muskets rained death upon the approaching revolutionaries. The battle seemed to favor the Spanish, but Bolivar had anticipated this. While the Spanish focused on the main attack, Páez and his Llaneros made their move. They did not charge head-on. They did what they did best. They flanked the enemy. With unbelievable speed, Páez's men swept around the Spanish lines, striking from the side, where the enemy was weakest. The Royalists, caught in the trap, began to falter. Their formation broke. Confusion spread. And that's when Bolivar gave the order. A full assault. His infantry surged forward, pressing against the Spanish defenders. The battle turned into a slaughter. The Royalists collapsed under the weight of the assault. Some tried to flee, but the Llaneros cut them down without mercy. The once mighty Spanish army, the last great force defending Caracas, was shattered beyond repair. By midday, Carabobo was won. Bolivar rode across the battlefield, his heart pounding. He had seen so many defeats, so many losses, so many moments when it seemed as though the revolution would die. But now he had done it. Venezuela was free. The path to Caracas lay open. The Spanish, broken and demoralized, had no choice but to retreat. Some fled to the coast, hoping to escape by sea. Others holed up in Puerto Cabello, their last remaining stronghold. But Bolivar knew the truth. The war in Venezuela was over. On June 29, 1821, Bolivar entered Caracas as a victor. The city, which had once exiled him, now cheered his name. The people who had doubted him, who had believed he was finished, now hailed him as El Libertador. But as Bolivar stood before the roaring crowd, he did not feel relief. He felt the weight of unfinished business. The Spanish were still in control of Peru and Upper Peru, modern Bolivia. The war for South America was not yet won. Gran Colombia had been born in battle. But could it survive? Bolivar had given Venezuela its freedom, but he had yet to secure the fate of an entire continent. The final war was still to come. Venezuela was free, but Bolivar knew the revolution could not stop there. The Spanish still controlled Ecuador, Peru, and Upper Peru, modern Bolivia. As long as Spanish rule remained anywhere on the continent, South America was not truly independent. His vision was clear: a unified, liberated continent. Gran Colombia had been formed, binding Venezuela, New Granada, Colombia, and Ecuador into a single republic. But Ecuador was not yet fully liberated. Spanish forces still controlled Quito, the heart of the region. Until Quito fell, Gran Colombia remained incomplete. Bolivar turned to one man, a commander he trusted beyond all others: Antonio José de Sucre. Sucre was young, brilliant, and utterly devoted to Bolivar's cause. He had fought beside him in Venezuela, proving himself time and time again. If there was anyone who could take Quito, it was Sucre. Bolivar placed the campaign in his hands. Sucre understood the challenge ahead. The Spanish General Melchor Aymerich commanded well-trained royalist forces, stationed in Quito's high-altitude terrain, where the mountains gave the defenders a powerful advantage. A direct assault would be suicidal. Sucre knew he had to be smarter, faster, and more relentless than his enemy. And so, in early 1822, Sucre began his campaign. The march through the Andes was brutal. His troops, made up of soldiers from Venezuela, Colombia, and indigenous fighters from Ecuador, pushed through cold, hunger, and exhaustion. They climbed through steep mountain passes, crossed raging rivers, and endured nights of freezing winds. Every step forward was a test of endurance and willpower, but they kept moving, because they knew what lay ahead. Quito was the last Spanish stronghold in Ecuador. If they won here, Ecuador would be free. Sucre's forces descended from the mountains, moving swiftly. The Spanish, caught off guard, scrambled to respond. Aymerich, believing he had the advantage, positioned his forces on the slopes of Pichincha, the towering volcano that overlooked Quito. From there, he could command the battlefield. Sucre knew what he had to do. The only way to take Quito was to seize the high ground first. At dawn on May 24, 1822, the Battle of Pichincha began. Sucre's troops climbed the slopes, muskets in hand, their uniforms damp with sweat and mist. The altitude made every breath a struggle. The thin air drained their strength, but they pressed forward. The Spanish, dug into their positions, opened fire. Muskets cracked in the thin air. Cannon smoke filled the sky. The revolutionaries fell by the dozens. But they did not stop. Paz's cavalry charged from the side, disrupting the Spanish ranks. Sucre's infantry kept climbing, step by bloody step, closing the distance. The Spanish, realizing their position was collapsing, tried to retreat down the mountain. But there was nowhere to run. The revolutionaries surrounded them. By midday it was over. The Spanish forces surrendered. The path to Quito lay open. When Sucre marched into the city, the people erupted in celebration. The Spanish rule over Ecuador was broken forever. The victory at Pichincha had sealed the fate of Ecuador. It would now be part of Gran Colombia. And then came the moment that would change history. On July 26, 1822, in the port city of Guayaquil, Bolivar met another liberator, José de San Martín. San Martín was a legend in his own right. He had freed Argentina, led the liberation of Chile, and marched into Peru. He had done what many thought impossible. But now, standing face to face with Bolivar, he had a decision to make. South America was almost free. But the final battle, the war for Peru, was still to come. San Martín, weary of war, saw in Bolivar a man willing to finish what he had started. In a secret meeting, the two men spoke for hours, debating the future of South America. No one knows exactly what was said. But when it was over, San Martín stepped back. He left the war in Bolivar's hands. San Martín would withdraw from public life, leaving Bolivar to lead the final campaign against Spanish rule. Bolivar had won Ecuador. Now he would march toward Peru, toward the last great battle of the revolution, and he would not stop until the Spanish were gone forever. Peru, the final battleground of the Spanish Empire in South America, the last stronghold of royalist forces, clinging desperately to their crumbling dominion. Bolivar had liberated Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. But as long as Peru remained under Spanish control, the war was not over. The revolution had come too far, endured too much, suffered too many losses to stop now. But Peru was no easy prize. It was the heart of Spanish power in the Americas. For centuries, it had been the center of colonial administration, the seat of the viceroyalty, and the base of Spain's military operations. Even as revolution spread across the continent, Peru had remained fiercely royalist, its cities filled with loyalists who had no desire to see Bolivar's dream of freedom succeed. Now it was time to break them. Bolivar entered Lima in 1823, welcomed by Republican forces who had already driven out the Spanish. But the victory was hollow. The royalists had not been defeated. They had simply retreated to the Andes, where they were regrouping under the command of Viceroy José de la Serna. From there, they planned to strike back to reclaim the city to crush Bolivar once and for all. Bolivar knew they were coming. He had fought too many wars to believe that a city's fall meant victory. The Spanish were gathering their forces, and he had to be ready. But there was a problem. Bolivar was exhausted. Years of war, endless battles, betrayals, victories followed by defeats. It was wearing on him. His body was failing him, illness creeping in, weakening him at a time when he needed his strength the most. And so, he turned to the one man he trusted above all others, Antonio José de Sucre. Sucre had already proven himself at Pichincha, securing the liberation of Ecuador. Now, Bolivar gave him the ultimate responsibility, to lead the final battle, to bring an end to Spanish rule, to finish the revolution once and for all. Sucre did not hesitate. He marched into the highlands of Peru, gathering what forces he could. His army was made up of Venezuelans, Colombians, Ecuadorians, Argentinians, Chileans, and Peruvians. A true continental force, united by one purpose: freedom. The Spanish had their last stand at Ayacucho. On December 9, 1824, the two armies faced each other on the rolling plains beneath the Andean peaks. Sucre had 5,780 men, a mixture of battle-hardened veterans and newly trained recruits. The Spanish, still believing they could crush the revolution, outnumbered him with 9,310 men. The odds were against Sucre, but so had they been at Boyaca, at Carabobo, at Pichincha. Bolivar had taught his generals one crucial lesson: the will to fight outweighs numbers. At dawn, the Battle of Ayacucho began. The Spanish, believing in their numerical advantage, attacked first. Their cavalry surged forward, hoping to overwhelm Sucre's lines. But Sucre was ready. His infantry held firm, their bayonets braced for impact. The cavalry charge stalled as musket fire ripped through their ranks. The royalists fell back, regrouping for another assault. Then Sucre counterattacked. His forces pushed forward, step by step, pressing the Spanish back toward the hills. The battlefield turned into a bloody chaos, with soldiers fighting hand to hand, swords and bayonets clashing in the dust. And then, the turning point: a battalion of Peruvian grenadiers, seeing an opening, surged forward and broke through the Spanish lines. The royalists, already struggling, began to panic. The army collapsed. One after another, Spanish regiments surrendered. By midday, it was over. The Spanish were defeated. Viceroy La Serna was captured, the highest-ranking Spanish official in the Americas, now a prisoner of the revolution. His officers, seeing no way forward, signed the Act of Capitulation, an agreement that ended Spanish rule in South America. There would be no more Spanish armies, no more colonial governors, no more viceroys. The war was won. For the first time in centuries, South America was free. Bolivar received the news in Lima. He sat in silence as the messenger finished his report. The dream he had carried for so long, the war he had fought for more than a decade, it was over. But Bolivar did not celebrate, because he knew the battle for independence had been won. But the battle for unity had only just begun. The Spanish were gone. After decades of war, after countless battles fought across the mountains, rivers, and jungles of South America, the enemy had finally surrendered. The revolution had triumphed. Bolivar had won. But as he stood on the heights of Lima, staring out toward the Pacific, he felt no relief, no peace, because Bolivar knew winning the war was only half the battle. Now came the hardest part: building a new world from the ashes of the old one. South America was free, but it was not yet united. The republics that had emerged from the war, Gran Colombia, Peru, Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, were still fragile, still threatened by internal conflict. The Spanish had been defeated, but Bolivar feared something far worse, that the newly liberated nations might turn on each other. And there was one land, high in the Andean mountains, that stood at the center of this uncertainty. A land that had not yet found its fate. Upper Peru. It was a region with no clear allegiance. Though it had been part of the Spanish Viceroyalty of Peru, it had also been ruled by Buenos Aires in Argentina for a time. Now, with the Spanish gone, no one knew what would come next. Would Upper Peru become part of Peru? Would it merge with Argentina? Or would it become something new? Bolivar had not fought all these years to see another war break out among the republics. He knew that the people of Upper Peru had fought for their own liberation, and now they deserved the right to decide their own future. And so, in August 1825, he sent Antonio José de Sucre to oversee the transition. The people of Upper Peru gathered, and for the first time in their history, they were given a choice. No king, no viceroy, no foreign ruler would dictate their fate. They chose independence. A new nation was born, and they named it Bolivia. It was a tribute to the man who had freed them, a recognition of the struggle he had led. Bolivar, the warrior, the visionary, the liberator, had now become the father of a nation. He traveled to Bolivia, riding through the highlands, greeted by crowds of grateful citizens. But as he looked at the faces of the people, as he stood in the plazas and walked through the streets, Bolivar felt something else. Responsibility. He had not only liberated these lands, he was now expected to shape them. And so, Bolivar set to work. With Sucre at his side, he drafted a new constitution, one that he hoped would serve as a model for all of South America. But Bolivar's vision for Bolivia was not a typical democracy. He believed in strong leadership. He had seen the dangers of weak, divided governments. He had watched republics collapse into chaos. He feared that if left unchecked, democracy would tear the new nations apart before they had a chance to stabilize. And so, his constitution included something radical. A lifetime presidency. Bolivar did not want kings, but he also did not trust short-term rulers. He envisioned a leader who would rule for life, chosen by the people, ensuring stability over generations. There would be a balance of powers, but the executive would be dominant, a president with nearly absolute authority. It was a controversial idea. Many feared it was too close to monarchy. Even Sucre, Bolivar's most loyal general, had doubts. But Bolivar believed it was necessary, because he saw what was coming. The Spanish were gone, but the real enemy was now emerging. Ambition, corruption, division. The unity that had held the revolution together was starting to break apart. Old allies were turning against each other. Generals who had fought side by side were now competing for power. The nations Bolivar had liberated were already beginning to drift away from one another. And there was another danger, the people themselves. Bolivar had fought to give them freedom. But what if they were not ready to govern themselves? What if, after centuries of Spanish rule, they had no idea how to be free? Bolivar feared that they would trade one form of tyranny for another, that instead of kings, they would fall under the rule of warlords, dictators, and corrupt politicians. Had he fought all these years, only to see South America collapse into chaos? Bolivia had been created, but Bolivar's dream of a united continent was slipping away, and he was beginning to realize that not everyone wanted unity, that some men, even those who had once fought at his side, wanted power more than they wanted freedom. And soon, they would turn against him. Bolivia was born, but Bolivar's dream of unity was dying. For years, he had fought for more than just independence. He had fought for a single, united South America, a nation that could stand as an equal to the great powers of the world. Gran Colombia was supposed to be the first step, a vast republic stretching across Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama, a symbol of what the revolution could achieve. But now cracks were forming, and they were widening fast. At first, it was whispers, discontent among the politicians, murmurs in the army, questions that cut deeper than any sword. Why should we answer to a government so far away? Why should one man decide the fate of so many? Is Bolivar truly a liberator? Or is he becoming a dictator? Bolivar felt it slipping away. The unity he had fought so hard to create was turning to dust. In Venezuela, in Quito, in Bogota, rival factions were rising. They did not want a single nation. They wanted their own power. They had bled for independence, but now that the Spanish were gone, they no longer wished to share it. And Bolivar? He had spent so many years fighting foreign enemies. He had never prepared for the battle that was coming. The battle against his own people. It started with rebellion. In 1826, his once loyal general, José Antonio Páez, led an uprising in Venezuela. Bolivar had trusted him, relied on him in battle. But now Páez wanted Venezuela for himself. He no longer believed in Gran Colombia. He wanted his own nation, free from Bolivar's rule. Bolivar rushed to Caracas, hoping to bring Páez back into the fold, hoping to remind him of everything they had fought for together. But Páez did not listen. The man who had once been Bolivar's greatest ally now stood against him. And Venezuela? The people had made their choice. They no longer wanted to be part of Gran Colombia. Bolivar had liberated them, and now they were liberating themselves from him. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than any wound. And then, in Bogota, things grew even worse. There was an assassination attempt. In September 1828, Bolivar was staying in the presidential palace when a group of conspirators stormed the building. Armed men rushed into his room, their swords gleaming in the moonlight. Bolivar had seconds to react. He leaped from his bed, barely escaping through a window. Outside, in the darkness, he hid beneath a bridge, his heart pounding in his chest. This was not the Spanish. These were his own people, and they had tried to kill him. The conspirators were captured and executed. But the message was clear. Gran Colombia was not just falling apart. It was turning against Bolivar himself. The years of war, of sacrifice, of dreams built on the battlefield, they were crumbling. The men he had fought beside now saw him as an obstacle, not a leader. The unity he had believed in was an illusion. And Bolivar? He was exhausted. His body was failing. The years of battle, of long marches and sleepless nights, had taken their toll. He suffered from tuberculosis, his once powerful frame now weakened by sickness. Yet he refused to give up. In one last effort to save his dream, Bolivar offered to resign. He thought that perhaps
story in my life. For more stories, must subscribe our YouTube channel Brain Sparks. The Brain Spark channel is for historical stories and worldwide news for history. Thanks for watching our channel.